Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The mountain loomed in the distance, its jagged peak slicing through the clouds like a dagger raised to the heavens. Legend spoke of a flame burning atop that mountain, a flame that had never been extinguished. The eternal flame, they called it. It was said to grant immortality to those who dared to seek it, though no one who had ever ventured to the summit had returned to tell the tale. But legends had never stopped adventurers before, and it certainly wasn't going to stop Arlen and his companions. They had trekked for days, their path winding through dense forests, rocky valleys, and snow-covered cliffs. Now, as they stood at the base of the final ascent, the end of their journey in sight, Arlen couldn't help but feel a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "We're close," Tessa said, her voice tight with anticipation. She was the warrior of the group, her armor battered and worn from countless battles, but her spirit was unbreakable. She had been the one to insist on this quest, to drag them all up this mountain in search of a flame that may or may not even exist. "Close enough to turn back, if we're smart," Arlen muttered. He was the oldest among them, a mage whose years of studying ancient texts had left him more cautious than adventurous. His long gray beard was tucked into the folds of his cloak, and his eyes, though sharp, held the weight of someone who had seen too much. Tessa shot him a look. "I didn't drag you up here to quit now." Arlen sighed, casting a glance at the others. Oren, the rogue, stood off to the side, fiddling with his daggers and grinning like the world was some grand joke only he understood. Kara, the healer, was crouched next to their supplies, tending to a small fire with an expression that suggested she'd rather be anywhere but here. And Doran, the silent knight, was sharpening his sword, his stoic gaze fixed on the mountain. "If the flame's real," Oren said, sheathing his blades and walking over to the group, "we'll be legends. People will talk about us for centuries." His grin widened, flashing white teeth. "Immortality, in more ways than one." "I'm not interested in being a legend," Kara murmured. "I just want to make sure we don't all die trying." Tessa laughed, her voice echoing off the rocks. "A little late for second thoughts, don't you think? We're almost there. We'll reach the summit by nightfall." Arlen nodded, though unease gnawed at him. The eternal flame had drawn them all here for different reasons: Tessa's ambition, Oren's thirst for glory, Kara's desire to heal, and Doran's loyalty. But something about the legends bothered him. Immortality wasn't something to be taken lightly, and every tale he'd ever heard about those who sought it always ended in tragedy. Still, there was no turning back now. Not after coming so far. They resumed their climb. The wind picked up, howling through the narrow pass they ascended. Snow whipped at their faces, stinging their skin and biting through their clothes. The path grew steeper, the rocks slick with ice, and more than once, they had to stop and help each other over particularly treacherous spots. The higher they climbed, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as if the mountain itself was trying to drive them away, to protect the secret that lay at its peak. They pressed on, though Arlen noticed something strange as they climbed. At first, it was subtle, a wrinkle at the corner of Tessa's eye that hadn't been there before, a few more gray strands in Oren's hair. But as the hours passed, the changes became more pronounced. Tessa's face seemed to age before his eyes, lines deepening, her youthful energy slowly giving way to weariness. Oren, too, looked older, his once boyish grin now framed by a face that seemed to have lived decades in a single afternoon. "Do you feel it?" Arlen asked Kara, his voice low as they trudged behind the others. Kara nodded, her brow furrowed in concern. "It's as if time is speeding up." Arlen's heart sank. He had read about this. The eternal flame wasn't a gift, it was a curse. It didn't grant immortality. It consumed it. The closer they got, the more it would burn away their time. "We need to stop," Arlen said, his voice rising over the wind. "Tessa, wait." But Tessa didn't stop. She pressed forward, determined to reach the summit, to touch the flame that had haunted her dreams for so long. "She won't listen," Doran said, his deep voice calm as ever. He had been quiet for most of the journey, but now his words carried a weight that made Arlen pause. "Then we'll die," Arlen replied, his eyes fixed on the warrior who was now barely more than a silhouette in the swirling snow. Doran looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps that is the price we pay." Arlen shook his head. "It doesn't have to be. We can turn back. We can leave this cursed place." But Doran didn't move. He was loyal to a fault, bound by his oath to protect Tessa, even if it meant walking into oblivion. Oren, however, wasn't so inclined to throw his life away. "Maybe the old man's right," he said, his voice tight with fear. This was a mistake. Tessa had stopped ahead, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her hands resting on her knees. She looked back at them, her face gaunt and haggard, the fire that had driven her all but extinguished, but she wasn't ready to give up. "We're too close," she rasped. "We didn't come all this way to die empty-handed." Arlen took a step forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Tessa, the flame isn't what you think it is. It's not immortality, it's death. The closer we get, the more it takes from us." She stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "That's not possible. Look at yourself." Arlen shouted, the wind carrying his words to her ears. "Look at all of us. We're aging faster with every step. The flame isn't giving us life, it's taking it." For a moment, Tessa faltered. Her hand drifted to her face, fingers tracing the deep lines that had formed where once her skin had been smooth. But then she clenched her jaw, her resolve hardening. "I don't care," she said. "I'd rather die trying than live knowing I didn't." And with that, she turned and began climbing again. Arlen felt a wave of despair wash over him. He had tried to warn them, but the lure of the flame was too strong. It was a siren's call, and it had already claimed them all. Arlen's heart pounded as he watched Tessa disappear into the storm. The air had grown colder, and the snow thicker, but the real chill came from the dread that settled deep in his bones. He turned to Kara, her face drawn and weary, and Doran, whose stoicism could no longer hide the deep furrows in his brow. Oren, standing apart from the others, wiped snow from his brow. "She's going to get us all killed," he muttered. "She's going to die," Arlen corrected. "And if we follow her, so will we." Kara's hands shook as she pulled her cloak tighter around herself. "Is there no way to stop this? No way to stop the flame from burning our time?" Arlen thought about the ancient texts he had read, the legends whispered about the eternal flame. He had known something was wrong, even before they started aging. Immortality was never a gift freely given. But he had never found any mention of how to stop the flame, only warnings of its price. "There's nothing we can do but turn back," Arlen said, though his voice was barely above a whisper. "Then why don't we?" Oren snapped. "Let her go. She's too far gone. We don't need to throw ourselves into the fire for her." Kara looked stricken. "We can't just leave her. She's our leader, our friend." Oren scoffed. "Friend? She hasn't cared about any of us since we started this fool's errand. She cares about the flame. Let her have it." Arlen's eyes narrowed. She doesn't deserve to die, Oren. None of us do. Doran, who had been silent all this time, finally spoke. We made a vow to each other when we set out on this journey. No one gets left behind. I will follow Tessa until the end. Oren sneered. Well, you can follow her off the cliff for all I care. I'm not dying for anyone. Arlen took a step toward Oren, but Kara placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. No. Let him go. There was a heaviness in her voice, the weight of exhaustion and fear. Oren stared at her, then at the others. His sneer faltered for a moment, but it quickly returned, though there was less conviction behind it. Without another word, he turned and began making his way back down the mountain, his figure vanishing into the swirling snow. We'll never see him again, Kara whispered. Arlen didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the path ahead, where Tessa had gone. The temptation to let her go, to let this all end, was strong. But he couldn't. Not yet. Doran was already moving, and Arlen and Kara followed, their footsteps heavy, their breath coming in labored gasps as the altitude grew higher. The wind howled louder, whipping through their cloaks and tugging at their limbs as if trying to tear them from the mountain. Time slipped away with every step, and Arlen could feel the years draining from his body. His bones ached, his vision blurred, and his hands trembled as he clutched the staff for support. Then, in the distance, through the storm, he saw it dot a faint glow, flickering like a candle in the wind, yet burning with an intensity that pierced through the veil of snow. The eternal flame. They had reached the summit. Tessa stood before the flame, her back to them, her arms outstretched toward the fiery light. She had aged more than the rest of them, her once strong, lithe body now hunched, her hair streaked with white, her skin sagging with the weight of years. Yet the fire in her eyes still burned bright, defiant, as if the flame had not taken her spirit even as it took her time. Tessa. Arlen called, his voice hoarse. She didn't turn. She took a step closer to the flame, her hand reaching out toward it. Stop! Arlen shouted, forcing himself forward. His legs screamed in protest, but he kept moving. If you touch it, it'll consume you completely. Tessa's hand wavered, hovering just inches from the flame. I have to, she rasped. I have to know what it feels like. It doesn't matter, Arlen pleaded. The flame isn't immortality. It's death. You'll lose everything. Tessa's head turned slightly, her eyes meeting his. They were sunken and hollow, but still filled with that desperate need that had driven her this far. Then what's the point of all this? She whispered. What was the point of coming here, if not to be more than human? Arlen reached her side, his breathing ragged. He could feel the heat of the flame, its energy pulling at him, drawing him in. The point was never immortality, Tessa. It was to live. To live with the time we have. That's all any of us can do. For a long moment, Tessa didn't respond. Her hand trembled in the air, so close to the flame that Arlen could feel its searing heat radiating from it. Then, with a slow, painful breath, she lowered her arm. Why does it hurt so much to let go? She asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. Arlen put a hand on her shoulder, feeling the frailty of her bones beneath her armor. Because you've been fighting it for so long. But you don't have to anymore. Tessa's lips trembled as she nodded, a single tear sliding down her weathered cheek. She turned away from the flame, and together they stepped back from the edge, but just as they did, a flash of movement caught Arlen's eye. Oren thought he had returned, but not to save them. His eyes were wild, his face gaunt, and he moved with the frenzied energy of a man who had nothing left to lose. He darted past them, his hands outstretched toward the flame, a crazed grin on his face. "No!" Doran bellowed, rushing forward, but it was too late. Oren's hands plunged into the flame, and for a brief moment, his grin widened as the fire enveloped him. But the grin quickly turned to a scream as his body convulsed, his skin shriveling, his hair igniting. The flame consumed him entirely, and within seconds, there was nothing left but ash. Scattered by the wind, the three remaining adventurers stood in stunned silence, watching as Oren's remains disappeared into the storm. The flame flickered, as though it had grown stronger from the sacrifice. "It's over," Kara whispered, her voice trembling. Arlen nodded slowly, his heart heavy with the weight of what they had lost. "Yes," he said softly. "It's over." But the journey back down the mountain felt longer than the ascent. Each step was a reminder of the price they had paid, and the lessons they had learned. By the time they reached the base, the snow had stopped falling, and the sun was beginning to rise over the horizon. As they stood at the foot of the mountain, looking back at the distant summit where the eternal flame still burned, Arlen turned to Kara and Doran. "What now?" Kara asked, her voice quiet but steady. Arlen looked at the sun rising in the distance, its light warm and golden, a stark contrast to the cold fire of the flame. "Now, we live," he said simply, and with that, they turned away from the mountain and began their journey home, leaving the flame and its curse behind them forever.